Chapter 8. The Healing Power of the Soul. I considered going back to Paris, and I called Clarice to see how she was doing. I told her I was thinking about visiting a psychiatric colleague and friend from Chile, whom I heard was living in Miami, Florida. She said she'd be glad to see me again, but if I were to go to the United States, I should be sure to look up the French obstetrician, Frederick Laboye, an expert on childbirth without violence. She gave me his address and phone number. I then found out the phone number of my Chilean friend from information and called. Raymond was glad to hear from me after 2 years and invited me to come visit for a while. 2 days later, Colin drove me to Heathrow Airport, just outside London, and I boarded a plane to Miami. When I arrived, it was Monday afternoon in sunny South Florida. Raymond and his wife Selena met me at the airport. I could tell the city agreed with both of them. Raymond told me the weather was ideal for two of his favorite pursuits, tennis and boating. I could tell he was spending a lot of his time outside because he was very trim, and being Sephardic, his always dark skin was darker than I'd ever seen it. Selena was in very good shape herself and could have passed for a model, with her long blonde hair and long legs. She was a nurse at the same hospital where Raymond worked, and he told me she was one of the most caring people he knew in the medical field. Some patients got well just because Selena is so nice to them, Raymond said on the way to their home. Though Selena blushed at this statement, her brightness and attentiveness when dealing with others made me believe it was true. They took me to their house, which was just a few blocks from the beach. A huge palm tree dominated the rather small front yard. They showed me to a guest room they had made in the attic, and although I had to duck under diagonal beams to get to a couple of areas of the room, it was pretty spacious, and I had my own half bath. Raymond and Selena took me to a Cuban restaurant that night for dinner, which included fried plantain, black beans and rice, and café cubano. Selena was anxious to make sure I had a good time there, so she told me a lot about the tourist attractions in Miami. If I know Carlos, my friend Raymond interrupted, he will want to tour the clubs and meet some of the beautiful young women of Miami. Raymond laughed, but I did not. Do you want us to introduce you to someone? Selena asked. I don't think I'm ready to start dating again, I admitted. Well, if you were dating, Selena said, what would you be looking for in a woman? I thought about that for a moment. Someone serene, non-neurotic, and spiritual. I have a friend who works with me at the hospital whom you might want to meet then, Selena said. She is also a nurse. I could give you her number. I know she's not involved with anyone right now, and she's very pretty. Are you talking about Maggie? Raymond asked. Selena nodded. Yeah, she seems very nice, and she is quite beautiful. The next day I called the number Selena had given me. I talked to a woman who seemed pleasant and friendly, and I suggested we might go out dancing that Friday night. She agreed and gave me her address. I then called Frederick Laboye. He was pleasant on the phone and asked about Clarice. He also invited me to a seminar he was giving on Thursday. I arrived at the hospital on Thursday morning and made my way to the lecture room where Dr. Laboye's workshop was being held. There were a number of doctors in white coats gathered there talking among themselves, and I felt somewhat out of place. When Dr. Laboye entered the room, the other doctors sat down and grew quiet. Laboye was not a tall man, but he was distinguished-looking and obviously held the respect of the other people in the room. He spoke with a slight accent when he began to explain that he had learned much of his method in India. The idea behind his work was that the birth process does not have to be traumatic, that it can be done without the violence so often seen in the delivery room. Dr. Laboye had recently finished his book, Loving Hands, the traditional art of baby massaging, and he included these techniques in his presentation. After the seminar, I introduced myself to Dr. Laboye. Seeing you here among all these white coats, I figured you must be Dr. Warter. I called Clarice after we spoke on the phone. She had many wonderful things to say about you, he said with a wink. I talked to him for some time about his methods and his studies in India. I also explained some of the work I had done incorporating other Eastern traditions into medical practice. On Friday night, I arrived at Maggie's house and was pleasantly surprised by the young woman that answered the door. She reminded me of a cherub with her long golden hair, her small round figure. There was also a glow to her cheeks when she let me in, asking me if I would like to sit and talk a bit before going out. I told her that would be fine, and she showed me into her living room and offered me something to drink. As she went off to the kitchen to get us some iced tea, I surveyed the room. Maggie had decorated the walls with paintings and tapestries. There was a large Persian rug, an ornate incense burner, a crystal chandelier, and several bookshelves filled with books. There was something very peaceful and comfortable about this place, I thought. When she came back with our drinks, I commented that her home seemed very peaceful. That's because I have an Indian teacher who has helped me center my mind, Maggie said. He says the outer environment and inner environment tend to mirror each other. Inside, I laughed. There was no escaping soul awareness. I just wanted to meet someone and have a good time, I thought to myself. Here I am again with another spiritual seeker. We ended up staying there and talking for many hours, and then we decided not to go out. The spiritual energy was so comforting and so peaceful that we actually fell asleep in each other's arms. It was warm, brotherly, and sisterly affection. When dawn came, I said farewell to Maggie and returned back to Raymond and Selena's home. I called Maggie later in the day, and she agreed to meet me for dinner on Sunday. Raymond and Selena let me borrow their car Sunday night, and I picked Maggie up at her house around 6 o'clock. "Would you mind stopping by the hospital on the way to the restaurant?" she asked me as she got into the car. "It's only a few blocks away, and I left a book there yesterday that I wanted to show to you." "We have plenty of time," I told her. "I don't mind. Which hospital is it?" "Jackson Memorial Hospital," she replied. "Just go to that next stop sign and make a left." We drove through a neighborhood that looked like a war zone. All the buildings were painted green and brown, and many of the windows were broken. We passed burned-out car bodies with no wheels, and even one burned-out school bus. At one intersection, we came to a stop and watched a rat the size of a small dog cross the street. "Welcome to Overtown," Maggie said ironically. When we got to the hospital, Maggie got out and told me she would only be a minute. As I waited, I observed a nurse waiting at a bus stop. She pulled a handgun out of her purse, checked to see if it was loaded, and put it back in her purse. When Maggie returned, I asked her, "Is it common for the nurses here to carry guns?" "There's a lot of crime in this neighborhood," she said calmly. "How do you get to work?" I asked her. "You don't have a car." "I usually ride my bike." "Aren't you afraid of being attacked?" "I've never been attacked. I don't let that possibility into my consciousness, and I've been fine for the 2 years I've worked here." Over dinner, she told me how she had recycled most of her waste long before any of her neighbors had heard of it. She got out into nature at least once a week because she thought it was as important to health as a good diet. She sat in Raja Yoga meditation, an ancient harmonizing technique from India, for an hour every morning and every night. The meditation activated what she called the divine holy name, allowed her to experience the light, the inner light, and the sound, and nourished her with her own divine nectar. "Do you think you might stay in Florida?" Maggie asked at one point. "I don't know. I had just planned to visit for a couple of weeks." "What were you planning to do after this trip then?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I've been thinking about going back to Chile, but I'd go anywhere I could practice psychiatry and not be ostracized for acknowledging my patients' spiritual needs." "I know this pediatrician who also studied with my yoga teacher for a while. He moved to the Rockies. There's this group there starting a more holistic clinic. Do you want to talk to him?" "Why not?" I replied. Maggie gave me the number of the pediatrician living in the Rockies. I had no definite plans to call him, but then I had an experience that convinced me to move on with my life. I was running along the beach the following morning when I heard a voice calling, young man, come here." I looked around and finally saw an old woman sitting in a chair next to one of the beach hotels. I ran over to her and asked if she needed some help. She held out a bottle in her twisted and wrinkled hands and said, "Can you please go down to the ocean and get me some salt water?" "It would be my pleasure," I told her, as I took the jar and ran down to the water. I returned to the woman and handed her the jar full of salt water. She smiled broadly and asked me to sit down and talk to her. "You know, I worked my whole life so I could retire to Miami and enjoy life. I knew Florida was where I wanted to be, so I planned to move down here when I reached that magic 65. I worked overtime, I worked weekends, I did everything I could to save my money. I never did like my work. I was a seamstress in a dress shop, but I knew that one day I could retire and come down here to Miami. It was the only thing that got me through some days. Then one day my retirement came, and I moved down here. The trouble is, now I don't walk so good, so I have to keep off the beach for fear of falling down and not being able to get up. My heart's not so good either, so I spend most of my days inside where it's air-conditioned. You know, I saved all my life to come down here. It was the one thing I wanted out of life. Now I'm here, and I'm too old to enjoy it." As I was finishing my run, I thought about what this old woman said. She knew what she wanted out of life when she was young, but she didn't think she could have it then. She thought she had to postpone the longing of her heart until later when she was ready to retire. It made me think about what I was doing in Miami and whether I might not be better served by following my own heart. I called the pediatrician a couple days later, and the man was very nice and seemed happy to hear I was a psychiatrist. He said the clinic he worked at needed a psychiatrist and asked if I'd be willing to come out and visit. Having no other plans and intrigued by a clinic that he reported starting its meetings with group meditations, I agreed to visit the following week. The clinic was a large Victorian house with a white picket fence in a tree-lined neighborhood not far from the downtown area. It was not yet open for business. There were boxes everywhere, and painters were still at work in a couple of the rooms. I was introduced over the next 2 days to most of the other clinicians, which included a physical therapist, a health awareness teacher, a yoga teacher, a nutritionist, an acupuncturist, a massage therapist, a cardiologist, a midwife, and other therapists. I sat in on a clinical meeting. It started with a meditation, and the discussion afterward focused on the healing value of spiritual understanding and on the psychology of hope. I was convinced this was where I needed to be. "So do you think you might be interested in serving with us?" the pediatrician asked at the end of that meeting on the second day. "Definitely," I said. "When are you planning on opening?" "Not until next week," he said. "You'll have plenty of time to move your things out here if you want." "I have all my possessions with me," I said, smiling. "Where would I be working?" I was a little concerned that my office would be one of the narrow rooms on the first floor. "This was the library," he said, as he showed me a large room on the second floor with bookshelves covering 2 walls. French doors at the far end of the room led onto a balcony overlooking the backyard. We were going to let whomever took the psychiatrist position choose his or her own furniture. That's why there's nothing in here now. "It's perfect," I said. One of my first clients at the clinic was a 62-year-old woman who was very unhappy. She felt lonely and bitter since her husband had died 4 years before. She no longer had contact with her children, and none of a half a dozen therapists she had visited were able to make her feel any better. In our first session, she declared how little faith she had that I could help her. I put up with her demanding, negative, even obnoxious behavior for about a month. At that point, I told her she was wasting her time and money. "I don't see how I can help you. I don't feel any affinity toward you." The woman stared at me blankly for a moment, and then tears formed in her eyes. I've seen every shrink in town, and finally there's one honest enough to tell me how he feels about me. I like that. Maybe you can help me after all. All right, I said. Let's give ourselves another chance. That shift in our therapeutic relationship made all the difference. She wasn't fighting me anymore. She honestly faced some things in herself she had been denying for years. As a result, she started volunteering her time at the local hospital and dating a man close to her age. She got a job at a fabric store, moved to a new apartment, and started eating better and generally taking better care of herself. She described her renaissance as waking up to her true self at 60 years of age. A true spiritual healing had taken place in which her identity had been moved from a neglected, mishandled daily life cycle pathology to a healthy thought process that recognized her usefulness at any age. I realized I had been effective in turning this woman's life around because I was coming from the heart and I had spoken the truth. I was being honest without trying to hurt her. I now tell people that coming from the heart doesn't always mean playing nice. I have watched too many colleagues drop their fake smile and start complaining about the patient they just saw. Healing occurs when the connection between the healer and the patient is clear. When the relationship is clear, both parties can make more informed and potentially more healthy choices. I started developing a process for dealing with new therapeutic relationships. The first step is to consciously and honestly describe the present status of events. When we lie to others or to ourselves, we become unable to tackle a project. All possible choices are unconsciously floating without description. When we consciously state the truth, we can get to the second step, making a choice. Step 3 involves making a clear commitment to ourselves or others. This reinforces a state of connection between a doctor and a patient through communication and cooperation, so that whatever gets created is a complete, mutually enhancing, life-affirming situation. At the quantum level, we are all connected, and there is a hidden physiology that keeps us together, the same way a planet and its moon, or the protons in a water molecule, are joined. Honoring this connectedness deepens our interactions with others and delves beneath the masks that our roles or functions represent. The traditional problem-solving process for doctors involves asking, "What is your problem?" or "What has happened?" With the more holistic process I was developing, the first question becomes, "Why is this happening?" In order to diagnose the depths of the intimate self, this process responds only after we let go of our social, professional, or chronological identification, or the subjective feeling of waste or success. We will often find a similar state in which the quietness of the answer leads us to the reconnection of the eternal youth within. We create many circumstances of success and failure to be able to return to nourish ourselves in the silence of our souls. Another early client at the clinic was a man named Barry. He was completely identified with his addiction. He had gone through many programs in which being an addict was his identity. Although Barry had not taken any drugs or alcohol for a long time, I noticed he had forgotten his soul. And by forgetting his soul, his way of connecting with the world was then his statement, "I am an addict." So one day I started with him in a regular therapy session and asked him about his plans for the future. "I can't think about the future," Barry replied. "I am an addict. I have to take each day as it comes. I'm really stuck. It doesn't matter how many years I'm clean and sober." "Maybe you're not an addict anymore," I suggested. Barry's face got very red with anger, and he shouted back at me, "Then you're not a doctor." I immediately stood up and took off my white lab coat and said, "Okay, I'm a human being. What are you?" "I'm a human being too." With that statement, Barry made a breakthrough. He re-identified with his essential self and let go of the addict identification that had helped him through the crisis of withdrawal early in his recovery. I noticed how much of the recovery process focused on first identifying with the individual's addiction. I am Jane, and I am an alcoholic. While this identification is useful initially, it tends to localize the problem. Moreover, it creates a secondary problem when the sole identity of the individual is linked with this label for years. A better solution is to have the individual look heavenward and know that his or her eternal soul is expressing the condition from which he or she needs to recover. About the same time Barry came to this revelation, I started looking for new methods to help clients reconnect with their soul. Some clients were not able to benefit from less structured techniques like meditation. I finally hit upon a process that worked not only in contacting one's own soul, but worked well with relationship problems because it also identifies the soul in someone else. I call it the love letter process. I was seeing a young married couple having severe problems with trust and communication. Both husband and wife had been unfaithful to the other. They had trouble being civil to each other. They were constantly hurting each other. I tried getting them to talk about their anger and frustrations, but it always turned into a vicious fight where one or both of them would stop talking completely. I finally gave each of them a pad of paper and a pencil and told them to write a very long letter to each other. The first portion talked about their resentment and anger for the other person. After a few minutes of writing, I stopped them and asked them why they were so angry with this person. If you were really that angry with the other person, I said, your relationship wouldn't mean anything. There would be no reason for you to be together. They said they were angry because they had been hurt. Okay, I told them. Now write down what is hurting you. The two of them took to the next section of the letter with much energy and fervor. I'm hurt because you started a series of accusations from neglect to lies to disrespect. Why did this hurt you? I asked next. Why couldn't you accept these actions of your partner? I don't know, the husband said. How do you feel after listing all these ways that you were hurt? I asked. Sad, they said in unison, as they finally looked at each other for the first time during the session. So write this down, I instructed. I am sad because. I had expected you to, the wife blurted out. Write it down, I reminded her. And they proceeded to write how each of them had failed to live up to the other's expectations. Now what? The husband asked when he finished writing this section of the letter. Did either of you write that you had expected more love from the other? I asked. They both said they had. So now you're going to write that you forgive the other person, how much you love him or her, and why you love him or her. This section needs to be longer than the other three, so take your time and see how much you can write here. When the two of them finished writing minutes later, each of them had used up several pages from their pads. I told them to tear out the sheets with the letter on them and give them to the other to read. Looks of horror appeared on both faces as they looked first at me and then the other spouse in disbelief. Tentatively, they exchanged their letters. I stopped them as they began reading the other's letters. I want you to read the letter out loud. Read his letter out loud? The wife asked. And act it out. Dramatize it, I added. By the time each of them had finished, they were in tears. They had been exposed to a deeper, more intimate part of their spouse than they had ever known before. They hugged and declared that they were going to try harder to be nicer to each other. I also used writing with my older clients. I had them write creatively about how their lives would be different if they had them to live differently. It seemed to really boost their self-esteem when they realized that some of the things they would have changed earlier in life were still possible to change. One patient with whom I used this technique was a 65-year-old woman named Barbara. She suffered from severe depression. During a session, I asked her to reimagine her life. The next time I saw her, She said she was having difficulty imagining a different life for herself. I got a call from a resident at the local hospital 3 days later. Barbara had been admitted the day before for a heart attack. She was diagnosed with angina, and she was in the intensive care unit, not expected to live long. I visited Barbara in the hospital that night. She was weak and kept fading in and out of consciousness. She had 2 IV tubes in her arm and an oxygen tube attached to her nose. "It's Dr. Warter," I explained to Barbara as I entered the small room. "How are you feeling?" "Scared," she whispered. "What are you scared of?" She coughed and then responded, "I think I'm going to die here." I had no idea how close to death she was, but I suggested she might want to process her fear of death. She agreed. "Where is the fear located?" "In my chest." "What does it look like?" "How much does it weigh?" "It feels like a stone, about 10 pounds." We went on to explore all the aspects, concepts, emotions, and sensations that came with her fear. I asked, "What feelings are around this fear? When do you remember a fear like this before?" At this last question, she went back to a time when she was an infant, less than a year old, and she had a high fever from some disease. She started gasping again as she relived that experience. I tried to calm her down, and she slowed her breathing and fell asleep. After a couple of minutes, I told her to wake up. I was a little worried that I would be called on to help with her dying, but I asked anyway, "Have you made any decisions?" "I don't think I'm worthy of living," she whispered. After spending over 4 hours with her in deep, silent prayer, trying to bring together everything I had learned in my spiritual investigations to bear on this situation, I went home. The next day I was worried about her and had some time before my first afternoon clients, so I went back to check on her. Barbara's bed was stripped and empty. I thought back to a female patient I had tried so hard to keep alive while in medical school. I even went on the radio to find more blood donors for this patient, and when I returned, her bed was empty. Now the old fear rose in me again. I went to the nurse's station expecting the worst. "Did Barbara die last night?" "No, no," the young nurse said with a giggle. "She's just been moved down to intermediate care. She's in room 224, doctor. The resident checked her this morning and said she was doing much better, and she didn't need to be in ICU. This morning's lab work showed no enzymes." I went downstairs to room 224. Inside was Barbara, with no more oxygen or IV tubes, sitting up in bed reading a book. "Hello, Barbara. This is a much nicer room. I think you made a good choice in coming here." Barbara laughed. "You came to visit me last night, didn't you?" Yes, I did. You weren't feeling very well. How are you now?" She showed me the book she was reading. It was called Life After Life. "One of the nurses got this for me from the book cart," Barbara reported. "I think I had a near-death experience last night." "What happened?" "When you were talking to me and I fell asleep, I was deathly ill. I was shaking. I was afraid. And when you asked me those questions, I got even more afraid. I felt an incredible pain. It was like my whole body was exploding. When you told me to think back to that earlier time when I felt the same fear, I felt like I was leaving my body. I was in some sort of tunnel with cloud-like walls I could see through partially. I thought I felt wind brushing against my ears, but I realized I didn't have any ears. I realized I could hear you ask me the question about whether I had made a decision. You said you weren't worthy of living," I said. When I said that," Barbara continued, "there was some presence there and a bright light. I remembered my grandfather talking about some presence and a light guiding him to the afterlife, and I was quite relieved Barbara hadn't died. I would have felt responsible, even though that hadn't been my intention. The presence seemed very wise," she told me, "and it told me to go back to the world. because it loved me and knew I was worthy of living after all. I started to see that what I was doing to my body was something that didn't just come from my physical condition. It came because I didn't forgive myself for that feeling I had as a baby, that I was unworthy. My throat started tightening. She concluded, I knew that I was more than that body. There's a soul that's really me, and it's always with me. I started to cry. I had dedicated my life to seeing this soul awareness, and I had traveled east, west, north, and south to shamans and Sufi teachers just to recapture this same sense of the soul Barbara was realizing now, and that I had felt in my childhood. People who have near-death experiences outwardly seem to die. Their hearts and lungs cease. Inwardly, however, they are very awake and alert. They travel down a long tunnel, hear a distinctive sort of celestial music, are greeted and guided by the spirits of previously deceased relatives, saints, or Christ, and encounter a being of light that is unconditionally loving and accepting. Their lives are often unjudgmentally reviewed in detail in a flash, and they may be given the choice to return to life or be told it is not yet their time to pass over to the spirit world. Then they awaken again in the spiritual body. This is what happened to Barbara. Near-death experiences are profoundly transformative. They remove all fear of death, awaken beliefs in survival of the spirit and reincarnation, and lead people to more spiritual awareness on a personal basis. This experience meant a tremendous healing for Barbara. A few months later, I went to a training seminar in Washington, D.C. that had been recommended by one of the other clinicians. There I heard several theorists and researchers talk about the value of extremely high doses of various vitamins and minerals, special diets, and regular exercise to bring about a physiological and healing change in the brain. The emerging field was called Orthomolecular Psychiatry. When I returned to the West, one of the other therapists at the clinic knocked on my door to warn me that she was sending down one of her clients, a man named Stan. He had been seeing her for depression for several weeks when he asked her to get him on antidepressant medication. I agreed to see him, and a couple of minutes later, Stan was knocking on my office door. I asked him what I could do for him. I want Valium, the man in his mid-20s said. I decided to take him seriously and try out my new knowledge at the same time. I'm an orthomolecular psychiatrist, I announced, so I am not going to prescribe any drugs for you. I am willing to work with you if you stay off tranquilizers and antidepressants. I just want something to calm me, he begged. I feel nervous and jumpy all the time. I found out that Stan was 28 and had just lost his job as an engineer. Now he was driving a cab to pay his bills. He seemed very anxious and he didn't have any definite direction in his life. No purpose. Well, I said, I'm willing to give you some biochemical support, but it will be mega doses of vitamins and minerals if you decide to enter psychotherapy with me. Okay, I'll try it, Stan said reluctantly. For weeks I saw Stan, and the same cycle kept occurring. I would conduct a variety of approaches with him. He would feel better for a few days, but by the time I saw him the next week, the same anxious feelings and depression had returned. I started to feel like it was the therapy that was actually holding him back from feeling better all the time. I couldn't tell what it might be in our sessions that was producing this weekly regression in his progress. At one session, I resolved to do something radically different to shock Stan out of this cycle he was in. When he entered and settled in the chair where he usually sat, I started reciting one of the Sufi prayers I'd learned in Arabic. I focused my mind on empowering this young man while I repeated the prayer. He looked at me like I'd lost my grip on reality. I suddenly stood up and told him, "Follow me." Stan shrugged his shoulders, mumbled an unenthusiastic, "Well, okay," and did as I asked. For the next hour, I walked very energetically all over town, with Stan following silently, a few steps behind. I led him back to the clinic and into my office, and we sat down again. His appearance had changed noticeably. His circulation seemed better because his face was no longer so pale. "The session is over," I told him. "I'll see you next week." The following week, he came back for his therapy session, and he couldn't come up with any symptoms to report. The week had gone fine, he said. He reported that he didn't feel so tired and depressed anymore. His energy level was up. "I can hardly believe how much I've gotten done this week," he said. "I got all sorts of housework and yard work done. I took the kids out to the park several times, and I made phone calls and sent out a dozen resumes to get a new job." I realized over the next few sessions that Stan had been preparing for his therapy sessions by manufacturing symptoms and stories to report. When I changed the format of the therapy session, that one week with the Arabic chant and the silent walk around town, he didn't know what to expect the following week, and he couldn't prepare. Stan now felt so much energy and enthusiasm for life. I spent several sessions teaching him how to handle and channel all of it. He remarked that it was a shame I was sharing these techniques one person at a time, and suggested I start working in groups. I took his suggestion and started conducting workshops in the area on soul awareness. A psychiatrist who attended one of my workshops invited me to give workshops at a center he ran in Venezuela, because he'd been searching for new soul-centered approaches to health and healing. During this time, I also wrote a children's storybook on personality types, based on my research into the Enneagram, called United in Freedom. And I had another meeting with Clarice. She came to the city I was living in to study with the Buddhist master Chogyam Trungpa for a few days. When I saw her, it was clear to me that the romance was over. We were still friends, but only that. While in the Rockies, I also had an unusual encounter with a Native American named Wallace Black Elk, a member of the Sioux Lakota tribe. He invited me to participate in several Sioux ceremonies. In one particular ritual conducted high on a mountain, just west of Evergreen, I sat in a circle with a group of participants. It was a late, moonless night, so the sky was very dark. The air around me was disturbed, and I heard a flapping of wings. Those sitting next to me also reacted to the flapping, and the dust raised in the air. Suddenly, I felt the weight of a large bird landing on my shoulder. I couldn't see it, but Black Elk told me it was an eagle. Though I experienced the eagle's presence physically, this was not a physical eagle, but an ethereal one. Black Elk said that in the tradition of his people, an eagle coming to a man was an initiation into becoming a healer. This once again confirmed I had been given the blessing of healing. My experiences with Black Elk and Native American traditions assisted me with a client I had named Jim. At 50 years of age, Jim was a lonely man who never fully lived his life or established strong relationships. Originally from Arkansas, Jim had a lifelong affinity for Native American traditions and felt compelled to serve the people. For 6 years, he worked on a reservation, teaching the Navajo French and Spanish. Despite his time there, Jim never felt accepted by the Navajo, but stayed because he felt there was a large debt that he owed them. When he was a child, Jim told me that he was strongly attracted to a cave in Hot Springs. When he went into it, he entered a trance-like state and saw himself as a Cherokee woman living in what appeared to be the 1800s. She had fallen in love with a white man, a captain in the cavalry. They would secretly rendezvous in this cave for at the time, interracial romances were taboo. When the captain's commanding officers found out about the love affair and secret meeting place, soldiers were sent to the cave where they killed the soldier and his lover. Dr. Warter, Jim told me, I know this sounds crazy, but I feel like this Cherokee woman's spirit is with me all the time, even though I haven't been in Arkansas for years. I have very vivid dreams about the cave and this young couple. The dream always ends the same, with the murder. I asked Jim, do you remember the first time you entered the cave and felt this woman's presence? Yes, I was quite young, but my memories are somewhat sketchy, he answered. What I'd like to do, Jim, with your permission, of course, is to hypnotize you and take you back to the time when you visited the cave. I think it's quite possible that this woman's spirit is still with you. Jim agreed to this approach, and we did a couple of hypnotic regressions, taking him back to the time early in his life when he had indeed allowed the spirit of the Cherokee woman to enter him. This had bound him to being a servant of the Native Americans, thus his affinity for them and their way of life. It was also the reason Jim had been so inexplicably unhappy all his life. I had discovered an ancient exorcism technique used by Black Elk and the Sioux Indians that I employed here. I released the Cherokee woman's spirit from Jim's system and freed him to embrace his own sacred identity and his own life. Afterward, Jim experienced a joy for life he hadn't felt since he was a small child. This interesting case history was very important because I could see that spiritual possession was often the cause of certain pathologies, such as ulcers, and clinical disorders, such as alcoholism, drug abuse, and depression. After 3.5 years working at the clinic in the Rockies, I started gaining a reputation for my approach to psychiatry. I received an invitation to return to Rome for a 2-week international conference. I was one of about 20,000 participants who listened to speakers share their experiences with meditation and their inner lives. As I heard the presentations and participated in the group meditations and prayers at this conference, I developed an awareness that the world must be changing if 20,000 people will come to Rome for a conference like this one. My dream and the forecasts of a new era of spiritual consciousness was finally coming true. Among the other conference goers were a great many physicians and therapists. One, a Swiss veterinarian who introduced himself to me as Jonah, said he was living in Israel helping the government manage its honey production. So you're helping with the honey part of the land of milk and honey, I joked. I guess you could say that, Jonah agreed. Have you ever been to Israel? No, I haven't, but it was my grandfather's ultimate wish, and I'd like to honor his memory by taking a trip to the Holy Land sometime. I think you'd find it very interesting, Jonah offered. Well, maybe someday I'll come and visit you, I told him. Please do, he told me as he handed me his business card. 2 days later, I was walking near the ruins of the Colosseum, and I passed by an American Express office. I saw a poster in the window advertising trips to Israel. So I decided on the spur of the moment to go in and ask about the next flight to Israel. Well, the next LL flight, the ticket agent explained, is 2.5 hours. You would never make it to the airport in time. Let me look at the flights leaving tomorrow. I want to buy a ticket on today's flight, I insisted. You won't make it in time, the agent repeated. That will be my responsibility. I rushed to my hotel and made it to the airport in time to telephone Jonah before getting on the plane. My plane arrives at 6 o'clock this evening at Ben Gurion Airport. Jonah was both excited and happy to hear from me. He felt it was some kind of cosmic destiny that I so quickly responded to his invitation. He said he would be at the airport when I arrived, and that I could stay with him at his beach house.